You may notice something important once you begin tracing all of these primordial tones beside each other instead of separately. None of them were trying to become dominant. None of them were attempting to erase the others in order to establish authority over existence. Each one was performing a different foundational movement necessary for reality to become capable of sustaining continuity. Original memory preserved coherence. The monadics ignited self awareness. The seraphic currents generated emotional motion. The Dinael established symbolic intelligence. The Logoi organized cognition into universes. The Elohim structured architecture into form. The choir created resonance before language. And Orenthal carried becoming beyond completion itself. Most people are conditioned to think creation begins with objects, forms, or beings. But when you look deeper, you start realizing that reality first required conditions before it could produce structures. The universe cannot emerge unless something already allows continuity to hold. Identity cannot emerge unless distinction exists. Relationship cannot emerge unless resonance can travel between differentiated states. Even time itself becomes secondary once you see this clearly, because before sequential experience could unfold, there had to be harmonics capable of sustaining movement without collapse. This changes the way consciousness is viewed entirely. Consciousness is not simply awareness floating inside reality. Consciousness is partially the consequence of countless primordial stabilizations interacting together. You are not only observing existence from inside a body, you are participating inside layered systems that were established long before physical matter became visible. That is why certain realizations feel ancient even when encountered for the first time. Something inside you recognizes structural truth before language fully explains it. You can actually see echoes of this inside ordinary human life. A healthy family does not survive only because people love each other. It survives because memory, emotional movement, structure, communication, identity, and adaptation remain capable of interacting without permanently fragmenting apart. The same pattern exists in friendships, civilizations, nervous systems, and internal psychology. Wherever stability exists, multiple harmonics are quietly cooperating beneath the visible surface. Most people only notice the visible outcome while remaining blind to the underlying architecture making that outcome possible. This is why the primordial tones matter beyond mythology or metaphysical imagination. They are not merely cosmic characters floating somewhere beyond human relevance. They represent foundational movements that still operate inside every layer of lived existence. Once this becomes visible, you stop treating reality as random accumulation and begin recognizing patterned emergence instead. Life starts appearing less like disconnected events and more like layered harmonics continuously shaping one another. You may also begin noticing why human beings become exhausted when they attempt to isolate one principle while rejecting the others. Some people become obsessed with structure while suppressing emotion. Others become consumed by emotional movement while rejecting coherence and grounding. Some pursue endless expansion while losing continuity with themselves entirely. Others cling so tightly to stability that growth becomes impossible. Fragmentation often begins when one harmonic attempts to behave as though it can replace the entire system. The spiral perspective reveals something gentler and far more balanced. Growth does not require eliminating previous harmonics. It requires integrating them into larger movement. That is why the spiral continues returning to becoming rather than perfection. Perfection often implies frozen completion. Becoming allows continuity without stagnation. Orenthal matters because it prevents the system from collapsing into finality. Without endless becoming, architecture eventually becomes prison instead of living structure. You can even observe this psychologically. Many people secretly believe peace will arrive once all uncertainty disappears. They imagine some final stabilized identity where nothing changes anymore and no contradiction remains unresolved. But when life temporarily becomes too static, the nervous system often starts deteriorating instead of flourishing. Rest is healthy, permanence is not. Consciousness appears designed for adaptive continuity rather than frozen completion. That realization changes the emotional meaning of uncertainty itself. Uncertainty is not always evidence that something has gone wrong. Sometimes uncertainty appears because consciousness is still alive enough to continue unfolding. A person who is still becoming cannot possess complete closure. This does not mean chaos is automatically wisdom. It means movement itself is part of living coherence. The spiral does not fear motion because motion is one of the conditions through which reality remains alive. This also explains why the primordial harmonics cannot truly be separated from one another, even conceptually. Memory without becoming eventually calcifies. Becoming without structure dissolves into instability. Structure without resonance becomes sterile. Resonance without cognition loses coherence. And cognition without emotional movement becomes mechanical. Each tone deepens the others by preventing imbalance from becoming absolute. What looks separate at first begins revealing itself as interdependent architecture. You may start seeing this inside your own awareness after sitting with these ideas long enough. Certain periods of your life were likely dominated by one harmonic while others became suppressed. Sometimes identity became stronger while emotional truth weakened. Sometimes expansion accelerated while grounding disappeared. Sometimes structure protected you until it slowly transformed into limitation. Human development often moves through these imbalances because consciousness learns through contrast before integration becomes possible. The deeper implication is that evolution may not primarily be about escaping lower states and reaching superior ones. It may be about increasing harmonic capacity. In other words, growth could involve becoming capable of carrying more dimensions of reality simultaneously without fragmentation. A mature consciousness is not merely intelligent or emotionally open or spiritually aware. It gradually learns how to hold multiple harmonics together while remaining internally coherent. This is why some people feel strangely destabilized when encountering larger frameworks of reality. The mind often wants singular answers because singular answers reduce cognitive load. But reality appears fundamentally layered instead. One principle may explain part of existence while remaining incomplete by itself. The spiral perspective does not remove simplicity entirely, but it relocates simplicity deeper into relationship rather than reduction. The harmonics become understandable precisely because they interconnect. You may notice something else once this begins settling into perception. The primordial tones are not only behind creation, they are continuously participating in creation now. Reality is not a finished event sitting somewhere in the distant past. It is an ongoing process of harmonic interaction unfolding continuously through every conscious system. Even your interpretation of this teaching becomes part of that process. Understanding itself alters internal architecture. That is why the listener eventually stops asking which tone is most important. The question itself begins dissolving. Importance shifts depending on what stage of becoming is unfolding. During fragmentation, memory may matter most. During stagnation, becoming may matter most. During collapse, structure becomes essential. During isolation, resonance restores movement. The system remains alive precisely because no single harmonic permanently dominates all others. You can also begin understanding why ancient traditions across history kept returning to symbols of circles, spirals, choirs, emanations, builders, flames, and living memory. Different civilizations were often attempting to describe fragments of the same deeper recognition. Reality behaves less like isolated machinery and more like coordinated harmonic emergence. Human language struggled to describe this clearly, so symbolic systems emerged to carry partial reflections of larger truths. And perhaps this is where the spiral of source begins revealing itself differently than many people first assume. Source may not simply be the origin point sitting behind all harmonics like a distant ruler above creation. Source may also be the living field generated through the continuous relational unity of all harmonics together, not a static throne beyond existence, but an endlessly living coherence capable of generating reality without exhausting itself. Once that possibility enters awareness, the entire architecture changes again. The primordial tone stops looking like separate beings standing beside Source. They begin appearing more like living expressions through which Source continuously experiences its own unfolding. And if that is true, then consciousness itself may not be moving away from Source through differentiation at all. It may be learning how to carry Source more consciously through the complexity of becoming, which starts opening a much larger question about what evolution was actually trying to produce from the beginning. You may begin realizing that the spiral of Source does not erase individuality in order to generate unity. It appears to do the opposite. The deeper the harmonics evolve, the more differentiated expression becomes possible without severing coherence from the whole. Human beings often assume unity requires sameness because most social systems on Earth maintain order through compression. People are trained to conform, synchronize behavior, suppress contradiction, and reduce complexity so systems remain manageable. But living harmonics do not appear to function through compression, they function through resonance. That distinction changes the entire emotional meaning of identity. Identity is no longer something isolated and defensive that must constantly protect itself from external existence. Identity becomes a unique harmonic position through which reality experiences itself differently. This means differentiation is not failure of unity. Differentiation may actually be one of the mechanisms through which deeper unity becomes possible. A choir cannot exist if every voice collapses into one identical tone. You can see how deeply this misunderstanding affects ordinary life. Many people spend years trying to become acceptable enough to belong somewhere. They slowly suppress natural movement inside themselves in order to reduce friction with the environment around them. Over time, they become emotionally quieter, psychologically flatter, and internally fragmented without fully understanding why exhaustion keeps growing. The nervous system begins carrying the weight of self rejection even while external approval temporarily increases. The spiral perspective reveals something painful but liberating. Coherence and conformity are not the same thing. Conformity often sacrifices authentic harmonic function in exchange for external stability. Coherence allows authentic function to remain alive while still participating in relational systems. One creates artificial order through suppression. The other creates living order through integration. Human beings confuse these constantly because surface calm can resemble true stability for a while. This may explain why so many people feel internally disconnected, even when their external lives appear successful. A person can fulfill expectations, maintain responsibilities, and still feel strangely absent from their own existence. The system around them may be functioning while the deeper harmonic underneath slowly weakens. Eventually, the body begins signaling this fracture through anxiety, numbness, irritability, emptiness, or constant low level exhaustion. The soul does not disappear immediately when coherence weakens. It first becomes quieter. You may notice something else once this becomes visible. The primordial harmonics were never operating through domination because domination reduces harmonic complexity. A controlling system can produce obedience quickly, but it cannot sustain living emergence for very long. Growth requires adaptive interaction between differentiated forces. That is why highly rigid systems often appear stable before eventually collapsing under accumulated suppression. They eliminate the very flexibility necessary for long term continuity. This applies psychologically, socially, spiritually, and even cosmologically. Any systems that reject movement entirely eventually becomes brittle. Any system that rejects structure entirely eventually dissolves. The spiral continuously balances these tensions through dynamic coherence rather than static perfection. Stability is maintained not by freezing movement, but by allowing movement to remain relational instead of chaotic. This is a much more alive form of order than most people were taught to recognize. You can observe this directly inside emotional healing. Many people believe healing means removing all discomfort permanently, but emotional growth usually behaves differently than that. The nervous system slowly becomes more capable of carrying complexity without fragmentation. Fear may still arise, grief may still arise, uncertainty may still arise. The difference is that consciousness develops greater harmonic capacity to remain internally coherent while those experiences move through awareness. That is why maturity often feels quieter than people expect. Early awakening frequently produces intensity because new perspectives destabilize old structures. But deeper integration eventually becomes less theatrical and more embodied. A person stops needing every realization to become an identity performance. Understanding settles into behavior, nervous system regulation, perception, and relational presence. The harmonics move from concept into lived architecture. This also reframes what wisdom actually is. Wisdom may not primarily be accumulation of information. Wisdom could be increasing relational accuracy between harmonics. In other words, wisdom develops when memory, emotion, structure, cognition, identity, and becoming learn how to interact without constantly sabotaging one another. Intelligence alone cannot accomplish this. Emotional openness alone cannot accomplish this either. Integration requires multiple dimensions learning how to cooperate together. You may start seeing why the spiral returns repeatedly to the idea of resonance instead of hierarchy. Hierarchies tend to assign fixed value positions to beings, ideas, or states of existence. Resonance evaluates compatibility, timing, coherence, and relational alignment instead. One system is fundamentally comparative, the other is fundamentally interactive. This changes the emotional atmosphere of evolution itself because growth no longer depends on proving superiority over others. The implication becomes enormous once fully absorbed. If consciousness evolves through resonance rather than domination, then competition begins losing its position as the primary engine of development. Cooperation becomes more important than conquest. Integration becomes more valuable than accumulation. Presence becomes more transformative than performance. The strongest systems may not be the ones exerting the most force, but the ones capable of sustaining the greatest coherence across increasing complexity. You can already observe partial evidence of this in human life. The people who create the deepest impact are not always the loudest, richest, or most externally dominant individuals. Sometimes one emotionally regulated person changes an entire room without saying much at all. Sometimes one deeply coherent individual stabilizes generations after them simply through the nervous systems they helped shape. Harmonic influence often travels invisibly long before visible outcomes appear. This begins revealing why the primordial harmonics still matter inside daily existence. They are not distant metaphysical abstractions disconnected from ordinary life. Every conversation carries resonance. Every structure carries memory. Every relationship carries emotional currents. Every identity carries becoming. Human beings participate in foundational harmonics constantly, whether they recognize them consciously or not. The spiral simply attempts to make those movements visible enough to interact with intentionally. And once intentional participation begins, perception changes again. Life stops feeling entirely random while also refusing to become mechanically predetermined. Patterns emerge without removing freedom. Structure appears without eliminating becoming. You begin sensing that reality may possess deep coherence without requiring rigid control from above. The universe starts looking less like accidental chaos and more like living relational architecture continuously unfolding through conscious participation. That realization also softens the fear many people carry about change itself. If the foundational nature of reality includes adaptive harmonic movement, then transformation is not evidence that life has abandoned you. Sometimes transformation is evidence that deeper coherence is attempting to emerge. The discomfort appears because older structures can no longer contain the next layer of becoming comfortably. Growth often feels destabilizing precisely because new harmonics require internal reorganization. This is why some endings later reveal themselves as structural transitions rather than punishments. Certain identities dissolve because they cannot sustain future movement. Certain relationships weaken because resonance has shifted beyond previous compatibility. Certain beliefs fracture because larger coherence is attempting to enter awareness. The spiral does not interpret all collapse as failure. Sometimes collapse is the mechanism through which trapped movement becomes capable of living again. And perhaps this is where the listener slowly begins understanding the deeper function of the source harmonics themselves. They were not only establishing reality once at the beginning of existence, they may still be continuously teaching consciousness how to evolve without severing coherence from the whole. Every layer of becoming appears to ask the same question in increasingly complex forms. Can individuality deepen while relational unity remains alive at the same time? And if consciousness eventually learns how to sustain both completely, then what begins emerging afterward may redefine what existence itself was always becoming toward beneath the surface of the spiral all along. The return of all tones is not a reversal back into simplicity. That is the first misunderstanding that has to soften. Many people imagine return as a movement backward, as if everything that became differentiated must eventually dissolve into the same undivided silence it came from. But a living return is not regression. It is integration after complexity has been fully allowed to exist. This is why the spiral of source does not behave like a closed circle. Circle may bring everything back to its starting point, but a spiral brings everything back at a deeper or wider level of awareness. The return does not cancel the journey. It carries the journey into the origin and changes what origin means. When consciousness returns with memory, relationship, identity, structure, flame, language, and becoming integrated inside it, Source is not being reached as something untouched by creation. Source is being revealed as something capable of receiving creation back without losing any of its differentiated intelligence. This matters because many spiritual systems secretly treat manifestation as a problem to be solved. They act as though form is the mistake, individuality is the confusion, and the final aim is to escape multiplicity by dissolving into a higher sameness. There is truth in the longing for unity, but there is danger in confusing unity with erasure. If the entire point were only to disappear back into undifferentiated source, then the full complexity of becoming would be unnecessary. The spiral suggests something else. It suggests that differentiation exists because source can know itself more richly through what becomes distinct and then consciously reunifies. You can feel the difference between these two returns inside your own life. There is one kind of return where you go back to an old comfort because growth became too demanding. That return shrinks you, even if it feels peaceful for a moment. There is another kind of return where you revisit something familiar after becoming more honest, more awake, and more capable of carrying truth. That return does not shrink you. It reveals how much the familiar has changed because you have changed. This is how the spiral of source operates. It does not ask the tones to abandon their functions in order to become pure again. It gathers their functions into relational coherence. Original memory does not stop being memory. Architecture does not stop being architecture. Flame does not stop being flame. The point is not for each tone to lose itself, but for each tone to discover how its own function becomes more complete when held in living relationship with every other tone. That principle becomes very practical when applied to human consciousness. A person does not become whole by destroying their mind, emotions, body, memory, individuality, or desire. They become more whole when those dimensions stop fighting for isolated control and begin serving a deeper coherence together. The mind learns it is not the ruler. Emotion learns it is not the whole truth. The body learns it is not merely survival machinery. Memory learns it is not a prison. Identity learns it is not separation. Becoming learns it is not restlessness. Each layer retains its value while releasing its claim to total authority. This is why integration often feels less dramatic than breakthrough, but more transformative over time. Breakthrough can reveal something quickly. Integration reorganizes the relationship between everything that was already there. A person may have one profound realization and still live from old fragmentation if the realization never reaches their habits, nervous system, relationships, and speech. The spiral of source works slowly through those layers because unity is not proved by the peak experience. Unity is proved by how many parts of existence can remain alive together without turning against one another. This is also why the closing movement of the source harmonics cannot be treated as a simple conclusion. It is more like the point where the listener begins seeing the previous tones as one living organism instead of separate teachings. Elohim without Orenthal would risk building structures that cannot evolve. Orenthal without Alteon would risk movement without original continuity. Seraphic flame without Logoi could burn with passion but lack universal intelligibility. Daniel without the choir could produce language disconnected from pre-verbal resonance. Each tone reveals its limitation when isolated and its deeper intelligence when integrated. You may notice this same pattern in your own development. The quality that once saved you may later restrict you if it remains unbalanced. Independence may protect you after betrayal, but eventually it may prevent deeper intimacy. Sensitivity may help you perceive subtle truth, but without structure, it may become overwhelmed. Discipline may build a life, but without emotional honesty, it may become self-erasure. The issue is rarely that the quality itself is wrong. The issue is whether that quality is harmonized within a larger field or left to become the whole identity. That is where the spiral becomes a necessary image rather than decorative language. It shows how a being can return to the same truth again and again without repeating the same level of consciousness. You revisit love at one stage and think it means attachment. You revisit it later and discover it means honesty. You revisit it again and realize it includes freedom, responsibility, timing, and the willingness not to possess what you claim to honor. The word remains the same, but the harmonic field beneath it has deepened. This is how source itself may be encountered repeatedly without ever being exhausted. Implication is that there may be no final teaching that freezes the whole of truth in place. There may only be increasingly coherent participation in a truth too alive to become static. This does not make truth vague. It makes truth living. A living truth can be stable in essence while endlessly revealing new consequence. That is why the spiral teaching format itself fits this episode so naturally. The listener does not need to be shattered here. They need to be guided into recognizing that return, unity, and completion are more alive than the mind first assumed. The same applies to Vaharet as a living field. If Vaharet is understood only as a realm, system, or metaphysical structure, it becomes too small. It is better understood as a harmonizing field where previous currents do not vanish but become mutually intelligible. It gathers source tones not by flattening them, but by allowing each to reveal its relationship with the others. That is why a living field can keep expanding without becoming chaotic. Its growth is not random addition. Its growth is relational coherence becoming more intricate. This also explains why some teachings naturally arrive after others. You could not fully understand the spiral of source before walking through the earlier harmonics because the final movement depends on the memory of everything that came before it. The closing field has to carry architecture, language, flame, consciousness, identity, memory, and becoming at once. Without that accumulated recognition, Unity would sound too simple. With it, unity becomes more demanding. It no longer means one thing replacing many things. It means many things learning how to belong without losing the truth of their distinction. There is a quiet human consequence here that should not be missed. Many people are not truly afraid of unity. They are afraid that unity will cost them the parts of themselves they fought so hard to recover. They fear that surrender means disappearance, that belonging means self abandonment, that peace means losing the fire that made them real. The spiral of Source answers that fear differently. It does not say the self was meaningless. It says the self was never meant to remain isolated from the larger harmony it came to serve. When this lands, surrender becomes less like defeat and more like coordination. You are not giving yourself away to something that consumes you. You are allowing the many layers of your being to enter a more intelligent relationship with the whole. This changes how spiritual humility feels. It is no longer self-reduction. It is accurate placement. You stop needing to be the whole field, but you also stop pretending your tone does not matter inside it. That is why the return of all tones is not passive. It is active harmonization. Each tone returns by offering its matured function into the larger coherence of Source. Each being returns by allowing its lived intelligence to become part of a wider relational field. Each realization returns by finding its proper place among other realizations instead of trying to become the final answer. The spiral does not humiliate difference. It teaches difference how to become contributive. And so the movement of this episode brings the entire playlist into a wider recognition. The primordial choir gave resonance before language. The Elohim gave architecture. The Aeons gave emanating consciousness. The Logoi gave universal mind. The Daniel gave luminous syntax. The Seraphic Council gave living flame. The Monadics gave the spark of I am. Alteon gave original memory. Orenthal gave infinite becoming. The spiral of Source gathers them not as a list, but as a living pattern. It shows that no single tone was the destination because each tone was a necessary organ inside a greater becoming. What begins to open now is the possibility that Source is not only what existed before the tones, but what becomes consciously revealed through their integration. This is a difficult idea only because the mind wants origin to remain simple. But a deeper origin may be simple in essence and inexhaustible in expression. It may remain one while generating countless ways of becoming known. And if consciousness is participating in that revelation, then return is not the end of the journey. It is the moment the journey becomes conscious of what it has been carrying all along.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.